The man who called me a museum prop had $1,100 fanned out in his hand like a deck of cards, and he kept counting it out loud so the crowd would hear. 1,200, he said, peeling off another bill, holding it up near my chin. $1,200, and all you have to do is blink. One blink. One little flinch. Prove you're alive. I stood my post on the forecourt of the old keep, eyes level on the middle distance the way they had drilled into me for 9 years, and I did not blink. Behind that unmoving face, I can tell you exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking, I know your name. I was thinking, you don't remember mine, and that is the most honest thing about you. You have probably seen this man without knowing it. Not his face exactly, but the kind of him. He builds the things that build other things. His companies have names that sound like verbs. He had flown in that morning, the whole entourage, to tour the state rooms because somebody on his staff decided it would look good for his foundation. And now he stood in front of me in a coat that cost more than my year's pay, fanning money, and the tourists had stopped pretending to photograph the architecture. He's not real, he announced to them, half turning, performing now. Look at him. They wheel these out for the cameras. It's a costume. It's a museum prop with a pulse, barely. A few people laughed because powerful men are funny when they want to be, the way thunder is funny if it is far enough away. I have made my whole life out of finding the broken part of a thing, he went on, the part everybody's too polite to point at, and I'll tell you what's broken here. A grown man, a fit man by the look of him, paid to stand still and let strangers laugh at him. That's not honor. That's the most expensive nothing in the country. He had a particular gift, I will give him that. He could say a cruel thing in a reasonable voice. Most men who want to wound you raise their volume. The dangerous ones lower it, so the cruelty sounds like a fact. He lowered his. I did not move. The bearskin sat its familiar weight on my skull, the chin strap a thin line of pressure I had stopped feeling years ago. My gloves were white, my rifle at my shoulder, my heels together on the worn stone, and the only part of me that was busy was the part nobody could see. I was reading him the way you read weather coming over a ridge. I had read men like him before, in places very far from this clean courtyard, where the stakes were not $1,200 and a laugh. 2,000, he said, and now there was an edge under the reasonable voice because the laugh had not become the thing he wanted. $2,000 right now and you twitch. You're telling me a man stands here all day and never once wants to scratch his nose. 2,000. I've paid more for worse entertainment. He stepped closer. The protocol is clear about what happens when a member of the public crosses the line of the post. There are words I am permitted to say, sharp and few, and the present arms, the warning that the still man can become, in one heartbeat, a soldier. I did not use them yet. I had a reason. He didn't know it, and I want you to feel, the way the crowd could not, how strange it was for me to be standing there. Because I knew this man's family, not in the papers way, in the worst night of his life way. He couldn't have known that. To him I was a shape in a red coat, but the badge on his lapel, a small enamel pin, a stylized falcon over a wave, I knew it the way you know the smell of a house you once lived in. It was the crest of a family shipping concern, a private thing, not the tech empire that made him famous. It was the badge his people wore on a coastline I will tell you about, on a night I have not let myself think about in full daylight for a long time. And the man counting out money in front of me, performing my smallness for a courtyard of strangers, was the grandson of a woman I had carried up a cliff path in the dark with my own 2 arms while the sea tried to take us both. He did not know that, so I stood and I let him talk and I waited to see what kind of man the boy from that night had grown into. That is the discipline they never put in the manual, not the standing, the watching. All right, he said, and he laughed again, but thinner now, a man who has told a joke twice and gotten less the second time. He's committed. I respect commitment. I respect a closed system. He turned to his assistant, a young woman with a tablet and the particular tiredness of people who work for the relentless. Get a shot of this. Caption it, the most disciplined waste of a human being I've ever seen. He said it like a kindness. That was the thing about him. He genuinely seemed to feel he was paying me a compliment by being interested at all. I have thought a great deal since about why men with everything come to a courtyard to break a man who has nothing they want. I think it is because we are a mirror they did not expect. A man who cannot be bought is an argument against the whole shape of his life, and he has to either look away or knock the mirror down. This one never looked away from anything, both the worst and the best thing about him. "Sergeant," murmured the guardsman to my left, very low, lips barely moving. "Pell 23, good lad, 2 months on the forecourt." "You want me to call it up?" He meant the duty officer. He meant this is escalating. We have a protocol, let's invoke it. He was right by the book. By the book I should have had this man moved back behind the chain 10 minutes ago, and if he refused, the wardens would have walked him to the gate with the firm politeness that is its own kind of force. "Hold," I said, the smallest breath of a word, the kind we learn to pass between us without moving the air. "Hold, Pell." Because something had shifted. The billionaire, I will call him by the only name the courtyard would have known, the name on the foundation, Mr. Caro, had stopped performing for the crowd. The money was back in his pocket. He had come right up to the edge of my post, closer than tourists ever dare, looking at my face with a different kind of attention. Not the showman's, the builder's, the man who finds the broken part. And what he had found in the half-second our discipline never quite hides from the truly observant was that I was not afraid of him. Not impressed, not nervous, not playing the game. Something else. "You know," he said, quiet now just for me, the crowd forgotten, "most of them have a tell. The young ones swallow. The old ones get angry behind the eyes. You've got nothing." He tilted his head. "What is that? Where did a man learn to have nothing?" I will tell you what it took not to answer him. It took everything. Because the answer to where I learned to have nothing was, I learned it on his grandmother's coastline, in a wind that peeled the words right out of your mouth, learning that a man who lets himself feel the full size of a thing in the middle of it will get people killed. I learned to have nothing so that I could do everything. And here was her grandson, having grown up safe and rich and clever entirely, because a few men once learned to have nothing on a black cliff, calling the result of that lesson the most expensive waste in the country. I did not answer him. I looked at the middle distance, where the gilded railing caught the gray morning light, and I let him find nothing. But I will not pretend it did not cost me. The manual has no line for the day the storm you once walked into walks up to your post in a good coat and asks you idly why you are empty. Mr. Caro straightened. The performance came back over his face like a tide. "Tell you what," he said, loud again, the showman returned. "I'll make it interesting. I'm here 3 more hours and I'll come back at the end of my tour. If you've moved, if I hear you so much as shifted your weight, there's 5,000 in it, donated to whatever sad little fund they've got for men like you. And if you don't," he smiled, white and certain, "then I'll have proven my point and you can keep your honor. It doesn't spend, but you can keep it." He patted the air in front of my chest, not quite touching, the closest thing to a slap a careful man permits himself. "Don't go anywhere." He laughed at his own line, they always laugh at that line, and swept off toward the stateroom doors with his assistant and 2 large men trailing him, and the crowd loosened and lifted their phones to catch his back. And I stood my post and let the morning go gray and ordinary again, and I thought about a cliff path, and a rope, and a woman's voice saying a word I have never repeated to anyone, and how the whole machinery of this man's golden life had been wound up that night by hands he would have called a waste. 3 hours. He had given himself 3 hours. He did not know he had given me something too. He had given me a choice I had spent 20 years deciding I would never have to make. Let me take you to the coastline, because you cannot understand what happened in that courtyard without it, and because I have decided, late in my life, that the night should be remembered by someone other than me. I was a younger man then, in a different uniform, the kind that does not have brass buttons or a bearskin and is not meant to be seen at all. We were a small unit, the sort governments keep for problems that cannot be solved with statements. I will not name us. The names never mattered. The work was the point, and the work was this. When a thing went very wrong where no help could come fast, we were the help that came anyway in the dark without lights, and we got the living out and did not talk about it after. The thing that had gone wrong that night was a ship. A private vessel, the Falcon and Wave on its funnel, caught broadside by a storm the forecast had promised would pass clean and had not. She went onto the rocks below a headland where the cliffs ran 200 feet straight into a sea that was, that night, a living animal. There were families aboard, not crew, not professionals who knew the drill, but the kind of people who own a ship and have never once feared it because money has always stood between them and the weather. The money was no use that night. The weather does not take bribes. We came down the cliff on ropes in a wind that tried to fold us against the stone. I remember the rope burning through my gloves, the spray coming up the face like the sea was reaching for us, the cold being a thing with intent. The vessel was breaking up on the rocks below, and what light there was came from her, from fires that should not have been able to burn in all that water and somehow did. We worked the line from the cliff base to the wreck, hand over the white chaos, and brought them off one at a time, all night, and we lost no one. I say that plainly because it is the only thing about that night I am proud of without complication. Not one soul. There are men who served 30 years and cannot say that about a single night, and I was given that one. The last one off was an old woman. She had refused to leave before the others, the matriarch of the Falcon and Wave, I learned later, who had stood on the canting deck directing the rescue of her own grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with the cold competence of a person who had run things her whole life, and was not going to stop now because the sea wanted her. By the time we reached her, she had been in the cold and the wet for hours and could not stand, and she would not be carried like cargo, so I carried her like she was my own grandmother, carefully, with both arms, my body between her and the cliff, up the rope path one slow step at a time with her weight against my chest and her mouth at my ear. And she said a word to me. I have never repeated it. It was not thank you. It was older and harder than that, a word from a language I half knew, and it meant, as near as I could ever render it, you are owed, not by her, by the ones I was carrying her toward up at the top of the cliff alive. She said it like a verdict, a thing she was entering into a ledger that the world keeps and does not show us. Then she went very quiet and I climbed faster and we made the top and the medics took her and she lived. 9 more years I found out later. I never saw her again and I never wanted thanks. We did not do it for thanks. We did it because that is what the dark is for. If you have the training and the stomach, you go into it so other people don't have to. Among the small ones we carried up that cliff that night, wrapped and shaking and alive, was a boy of perhaps 4 years old. I did not carry him myself. One of my men did, a man named Hale, gone now, who tucked the boy inside his own jacket against the wind and went up the rope like that, 2 heartbeats under one wet coat. I saw the boy's face for a moment at the top, in the swinging light of a medic's lamp, pale, enormous-eyed, too cold even to cry, looking at all of us in our black gear with the expression of a child deciding, in that instant, that the world was a place where dark shapes came out of the storm and saved you. I have wondered since, what a child does with a lesson like that, whether he grows up grateful or grows up believing he is simply the kind of person the dark shapes always come for, and stops being able to see the shapes at all. I think now that I know. Because the badge on Mr. Caro's lapel was the Falcon and the Wave, and Mr. Caro was exactly the right age, and Mr. Caro had a way of looking at a man in a uniform as though it were a costume worn by someone whose whole purpose was to be of use to him. And I had stood on that forecourt and watched the boy from the top of the cliff, grown into a man who had never once in 20 years had to be cold against his will, count out money to make me flinch. He did not remember, why would he? He had been 4 years old, and the family had surely sealed the night away the way the wealthy seal away ugly things, paid for, never spoken of, a bad weekend, a lucky escape, the insurance handled. Nobody tells a 4-year-old you are alive because 6 men went down a cliff in the dark and one of them carried your grandmother up it with her mouth at his ear. Nobody enters the verdict in the ledger where the child can read it. But the ledger is real. The old woman knew it. You are owed. I came back to the forecourt and the gray morning and the weight of the bearskin, and Pell was watching me sideways, worried, because I had been somewhere else for a moment, and a guardsman who goes somewhere else is a guardsman about to make a mistake. "Sergeant," he breathed. "You all right?" "I'm fine, Pell," I said, the words moving between us under the still air. And I was. But I will tell you what I was turning over in the part of me that was not standing still. I was turning over the fact that in 3 hours this man was going to come back to my post, and I had 2 roads in front of me, and I hated them both. The first road was the manuals, and it was the easy one. I stand. I do not flinch. He films his little video, makes his point that the disciplined man is a waste, donates his $5,000 to look generous, and leaves, never knowing that the prop in the red coat once carried his blood up a cliff in the dark. I keep my honor, which, as he correctly observed, does not spend. And the verdict in the ledger, "You are owed," goes on being a thing only a dead woman and an aging sergeant ever knew. The guard does not speak. The guard is not in the business of collecting on debts the public does not know exist. And the second road frightened me, because it required the one thing the manual forbids above all others. Not to flinch. I would never flinch, but to speak. To stop being the prop and become a man with a name and a memory, and to say to this grandson of the falcon and wave the thing that would either humble him into something better or shatter the only version of himself he knew how to be. A man's whole understanding of his own life is a load-bearing wall. You do not knock it out for a laugh in a courtyard. You knock it out only if you are very sure the house will stand better without it. 3 hours. The tour groups came and went across the forecourt. The gray lifted a little toward noon and the gilded railing brightened. Pell relaxed by degrees beside me, and I stood my post and watched the stateroom doors and did the hardest arithmetic of my disciplined life, which was not whether I could stay silent. I could always stay silent. Silence is the easiest thing in the world for a man like me, but whether I should. He came back early. I knew it was him before I saw him, by the way the crowd rearranged itself, the small currents that move through a public space when someone important enters it. Then the stateroom doors opened and Mr. Carroll came down the steps with his assistant and his 2 large men, and he was not finished with me. I had hoped 3 hours of staterooms and old paintings might have moved him on to some new interest. Men like him are usually finished with a toy by the time the next one appears. But I had underestimated him. He had not been bored by me. He had been bothered by me. That is a different thing and a more dangerous one. "There he is," he said, coming straight across the stone, his voice bright and hard, "a man who has had 3 hours to feel a small humiliation grow into a thing he needs to settle. Still here, still standing. I asked the guide about you people, about the rules. Fascinating stuff." He stopped a careful arm's length from the chain, his eyes going over me top to bottom, the builder finding the broken part. "You're not allowed to react. That's the actual rule. A member of the public can do almost anything short of laying hands on you, and you have to stand there. You can ask me to step back. You can stamp your little boot. But you can't touch me, you can't tell me off, you can't break. The whole thing only works if you stay a statue. Did I get that right?" He had gotten it close enough. The protocol is more than that. The wardens, the duty officer, the present arms that turns the statue back into a soldier. But the heart of it was true, and he had found it the way he found the broken part of everything, by looking where other people are too polite to look. "So here's what I think," he said, performing for the courtyard again, but underneath it I could hear the bother, the itch he could not reach. "The discipline is real. I came back to mock you, and I'm going to leave a little impressed, and I don't say that often, but it's also a cage. Somebody convinced you that standing still and taking it is honor, and now you'll defend the cage because it's all you've got. And I find that," he searched and found a cruel word in his reasonable voice, "sad. I genuinely do. I look at you, and I see a man who could have built something, and instead he stands in a costume so tourists like me have somebody to feel superior to. And here is where the morning turned, where it stopped being about me at all, because Mr. Caro was not the only member of his party on the forecourt that day. There was a girl with him. I had not understood in the morning's performance who she was, a slight figure of 9 or 10 in a good coat at the edge of the entourage, trailing an adult clearly paid to mind her, watching the great man with the blank patience of a child who has spent a great deal of time waiting for the adults in her life to be finished. She was his daughter. I would learn that within the hour. And while Mr. Caro stood at my post explaining to a courtyard full of strangers that I was a sad man in a cage, his daughter had wandered, the way children do when the adults are absorbed in their own importance, away from the minder, across the forecourt, toward the open arch at its far end where the public stops and the working courtyard begins, where there is a gate, and beyond it the service road, and on the service road that day, the slow, heavy reversing of a supply lorry whose driver could not possibly see a small figure stepping off the curb of the only world she had ever known to be safe. I saw her go. Of course I saw her go. The watching is the discipline, I have told you that. While Mr. Caro performed my smallness, I had been doing the only job that is truly mine, to see everything in front of my post, and I saw the child drift, and the minder distracted by the showman's voice like everyone else, and the line of her path and the line of the lorry's path, and I saw, with the cold, clean arithmetic the cliff had burned into me 20 years before, exactly where the two lines met and how many seconds there were until they did. There were not many seconds. I did not decide to move. There was no decision. The man who counts out money to make you flinch believes, I think, that discipline is the absence of action, a man trained into a cage, a man who cannot move. He had it exactly backward, and he was about to learn it backward in front of the whole forecourt. Discipline is not the absence of action. Discipline is action made so fast and so right that it looks, from the outside, like the statue simply decided to be alive. I broke my post. I did the thing that in 9 years I had never once done. I left the chain. I left the still air. I came off my mark at a speed the courtyard had not known was in the red coat, and I crossed the forecourt stone in a line as straight and certain as the line I had read between the child and the lorry. I heard the chin strap bite as my head came down. I heard, distantly, somebody scream, the minder maybe, finally seeing it. I did not hear Mr. Caro at all. Whatever clever thing he had been saying about my cage stopped mattering at the exact instant I moved, and I have always thought there was a justice in that his voice was the thing the morning erased. I reached her at the gate. I will not dress it up. There was no time for grace. I got an arm across her and took her off her feet and turned my own body into the path of the thing that was coming, the way I had turned my body into the cliff face 20 years before with her great-grandmother against my chest, and the lorry's rear corner passed close enough that I felt the wind of it move the fur of the bearskin. Then we were clear, the two of us, on the safe side of the gate, and she was a small shaking weight against my red wool, exactly the way the old woman had been a weight against my black gear in the dark, and the whole forecourt had gone silent, the way crowds go silent when they have all at once understood how close they came to seeing something they could never unsee. And I knelt on the stone of the forecourt with the billionaire's daughter held against me, both of us breathing hard, and I lifted my eyes, and Mr. Caro was standing exactly where I had left him, 10 feet away, with his clever certain face come completely apart, looking at the prop in the costume holding his child off the ground, and I watched the whole architecture of how he understood the world fall down behind his eyes. He did not move at first. That is what I remember. A man who, 90 seconds before, had been the most certain object in the courtyard, who had built his whole self out of naming the broken part of every situation before anyone else. And the one situation he had not seen coming had walked right past his knee, while he was busy explaining my cage to strangers. He stood there with his mouth a little open, and his hands a little out, for the first time since he arrived completely without a line. The minder reached us, white and undone, and I let the girl go gently. She was shaking, and steadied her onto her own feet and turned her toward the woman whose whole job had just nearly ended in the worst way a job can end. The girl went to her, and there were the high sounds of a frightened child finally allowed to be frightened, and the courtyard came back to life all at once, the way a held breath comes back, in noise and the lifting of every phone in the place. I got to my feet. My knee had a long scuff across the red wool where I had gone down on the stone. The bearskin had slipped half an inch on my brow, and I was breathing in a way a guard on post is never permitted to breathe. By every line of the manual, I had just committed the gravest breach of my service. I had abandoned my post. There is no asterisk in the standing orders that says except to save a life. The orders say you do not leave the post. I had left the post. And I stood there in the noise with the scuff on my knee, and I was not sorry. And I have never been sorry. And that is the one place where I have always known the manual was wrong and I was right. Pell had come off his own mark, properly, by the book, sealing the breach, calling it up, the duty officer already crossing the forecourt at speed with 2 wardens. The machine was engaging around me the way the machine does. There would be a report, a board, very possibly the end of 9 years on this forecourt, because the institution that had drilled my stillness into my bones does not bend its rules even for the reasons that make a man worth keeping. I knew all of that standing there, and none of it was the thing in front of me. The thing in front of me was Mr. Caro, finding his feet, coming toward me across the stone. Not slowly now. Fast, the way a man moves when the floor of his life has tilted, and he is trying to reach the one solid thing in the room. He came past the duty officer, the wardens, his own large men, and stopped in front of me closer than he had stood all day. And the reasonable voice was gone, and the showman was gone, and what was left was a man of about my own age looking at me with an expression I had seen exactly once before, 20 years and 200 feet up a cliff before, on the white enormous-eyed face of a 4-year-old boy in the swinging light of a medic's lamp. "You," he said, and stopped. His clever mouth could not find the shape of it. "You went through the you put yourself." He looked back at his daughter, safe now in the minder's arms, then at the gate, then at me, doing the arithmetic I had done in half a second slowly, the way a man does when his hands are shaking. "If you had been a statue," he said, very low, "she would be," and he could not say that word either, and I was glad he could not, because there are words a man should never have to say about his own child, and the whole point of my morning's work was that he never would. "You should sit down, sir," I said. It was the first thing I had said to him all day. 3 words. After all his thousands about my silence, my cage, the most expensive nothing in the country, 3 plain words from the prop, and they hit him harder than anything else could have, because they were kind. He had come at me all morning with cruelty in a reasonable voice, and the only voice I gave him back was kind, and it broke something in him that the lorry had only cracked. He did not sit down. He stood there in front of me, and he wept quietly, with the particular awful restraint of a powerful man who has not let himself do it in years, and does not know how to do it small. And the forecourt watched a billionaire come apart at the post of a RoyalGuard, and I will tell you it gave me no pleasure at all. I had thought, in some sour corner of those 3 hours, that I might enjoy this. I did not. There is no pleasure in watching a man learn, all at once and too late, the true weight of a thing he treated as a joke. There is only the hope that the lesson takes. And it would have ended there. By every measure the morning was already complete. He had been humbled, not by any hidden rank or reveal, but by the simplest, oldest thing in the world. The man he had called a waste was the only person in the courtyard fast enough and willing enough to save what he loved most. He would have left a changed man on that alone. The cliff could have stayed in the dark where I had kept it for 20 years. I had won the argument he came to have, without a single word about who I was, and that should have been enough. It would have been enough. But then the old woman's verdict came due, in a way I had not foreseen. As Mr. Carroll stood there weeping in front of me, he reached up to steady himself, I think, or just to do something with his shaking hands, and his fingers closed over the small enamel pin on his lapel, the falcon over the wave, and he looked down at it as a man does at a familiar object when his world has gone strange, and then back up at me, and I saw a new thing begin to move behind his ruined certainty. Not the lorry. Something older that the gripping of that badge had stirred. That night, I said. I had not meant to say it. I had decided, in the 3 hours of arithmetic, that I would not, that the prop stays silent, and the debt stays a secret between a dead woman and an aging sergeant, because you do not knock out the load-bearing wall of a man's understanding for a courtyard's entertainment. But the man in front of me was not being entertained. The wall had already come down on its own, the lorry had taken it, and he was standing in the rubble looking for one solid thing, and I found, to my own surprise, that I was not going to let him stand there alone in it. That is also the discipline they do not put in the manual. Knowing the difference between a man you must not unmake and a man who has just been unmade and needs to be told why. That night, I said again, and the courtyard had gone very quiet, the wardens holding, the duty officer holding, everyone feeling that something was happening here larger than a breach of post. The falcon and the wave, the ship on the rocks under the headland 20 years ago this winter, the storm the forecast said would pass. I watched the words land on him one at a time, each one taking something out of his face and putting something else in. You were 4 years old. You went up the cliff inside a man's jacket against the wind, 2 heartbeats under one wet coat. His name was Hale. He's gone now. He carried you because you were too cold even to cry. He had stopped breathing. I do not say that as a figure of speech. He stood absolutely still in front of me, stiller than he had been all day, stiller than I had ever stood on my post, and I understood that I had finally given the showman an experience of the thing he had been mocking. For one long moment Mr. Carroll knew exactly what it is to be unable to move. "How do you?" he started and could not finish and tried again. "Nobody," that was sealed. "The family never, how could you possibly?" "Because I was there," I said. And I told him. Not all of it. Some of that night belongs to the men I served with and to the dark, and it is not for a courtyard. But I told him the shape of it. The unit that does not have brass buttons and is not meant to be seen, the ropes and the wind that tried to fold us against the stone. The line worked from cliff base to wreck all night until everyone was off and no one was lost. And I told him about the old woman who would not leave before the others, who directed the rescue of her own from the canting deck, with the cold competence of a person who had run things her whole life, and was not going to stop because the sea wanted her. My grandmother, he said, just that, a small wrecked word. I carried her up the rope path, I said. She would not be carried like cargo, so I carried her like she was my own, one step at a time, my body between her and the cliff. She lived 9 more years. I never saw her again, and I never wanted thanks. I paused, because the next part was the part the morning had been building toward all along. On the way up, with her mouth at my ear, she said one word to me. I have never repeated it. It was not thank you. It was a verdict. It meant, as near as I can ever render it, you are owed, not by her, by the ones I was carrying her toward up at the top of the cliff alive. I looked at him, the grandson of the falcon and the wave, the boy from the top of the cliff, grown into the man who had counted out money to make me flinch. You, Mr. Carroll, I said, she meant you. The courtyard did not make a sound. Even the phones had stopped lifting. People had forgotten to film, which is the rarest thing in the modern world, a crowd so far inside a moment that they forget to capture it. And Mr. Carroll stood with the falcon and wave gripped in his shaking hand, and 20 years of a sealed-away night opening behind his eyes. And he understood. I watched him understand that everything he was, everything he had built, every clever certain thing he had ever said about waste and value, and the broken part of the world, rested on a foundation laid in the dark by men he would have called props. that his whole golden life had been wound up that night by hands he had spent the morning mocking, that he had called the most expensive nothing in the country to the face of the man who had carried his grandmother up a cliff so that he could grow up to afford the coat he was wearing. "I owe you," he said. It came out of him as barely a breath. "I owe you everything. My whole—" He looked at his daughter, safe in the minder's arms, and then at his own hands, and then at me, and the arithmetic of it was finally complete in him, the full size of the debt, generation upon generation. "And I came here and he could not say it." The cruelty in the reasonable voice, the money fanned out near my chin, the most expensive waist in the country. He could not say any of it back to me, and I did not need him to. "You didn't know," I said. "A man can't pay a debt he was never told he owed. You were 4 years old. Nobody enters the verdict in the ledger where the child can read it." I let that sit, and then I gave him the only absolution that was mine to give. "You know now, that's the whole of it. The debt was never money. It was never a flinch in a courtyard. It was only ever this, that you should know what you were carried up out of and who carried you, and that you should carry someone yourself someday when it's your turn in the dark. That's how the ledger clears, not by paying me. By being for somebody else, the shape that comes out of the storm. I think now that for once, for this one man, on the morning his world came apart, the silence was not the honor. The honor was the telling. There is a kind of discipline that is a wall, the cage a man defends because it is all he has, and there is a kind that knows precisely when the wall should come down, and has the strength to take it down with its own hands. That is the harder kind, and I had only learned it that morning. The duty officer was at my elbow then, quietly, because the machine had waited as long as it could and could wait no longer. There was the breach. I had abandoned my post. There were standing orders, and there was a board, and there would be a reckoning, and I went with him without a word, because that part of the discipline is not a wall. It is simply the truth. I had broken the orders, and a man who breaks the orders answers for it, and I would not have respected an institution that pretended otherwise. I left Mr. Caro standing in the forecourt with his daughter and his ruined certainty and the falcon and wave in his hand, and I did not look back, because a guard does not look back, and because there was nothing more I needed from him. The ledger was clear. I will not pretend the board was nothing. I stood in front of 3 officers in a paneled room and told it plainly. I left my post. I had no order to do so. I would do it again. I did not plead the life I had saved as an excuse, because it was not an excuse, it was a reason, and the difference matters in a place built on orders. The senior of the 3 was an old soldier himself, the kind whose medals are mostly the kind you do not wear, and he listened without expression, and at the end he was quiet a long moment, and then he said the only thing that has ever made me prouder than that night on the cliff. The orders exist so that men who cannot tell the difference will still do the right thing. You can tell the difference. That is why we keep you. And he entered a formal note of the breach into my record, because the wall must stand, and beside it a commendation, because the man behind the wall must be known, and he sent me back to my post. So I went back. That is the part the courtyard never saw, the part that comes after the phone stopped lifting. There was no parade, no convoy at the gates. There was a scuff on the knee of my red wool the tailors could not quite lift, and an old soldier's verdict in a paneled room, and the forecourt of the old keep on an ordinary gray morning, and me, standing my post, eyes level on the middle distance, the bearskin's familiar weight on my skull, exactly as before. The tourists came and went and did not know me. That is as it should be. The honor of the work has never once depended on being known. Mr. Caro wrote to me after. I will not tell you what the letter said. Some things are between 2 men, and the dark they were both pulled out of. I will tell you only that he did not offer me money, not once in any line of it, and that this was the surest sign he had finally understood, and that his foundation, the one his staff had thought would look good with a palace tour behind it, quietly began funding the small, unmarked units that go down cliffs in the dark so other people don't have to. He never put his name on it. That too was a sign. People ask me sometimes, the few who know any part of this, whether it was worth it. The breach on my record, the risk of 9 years. And I tell them what the old woman taught me with her mouth at my ear, 200 feet up a cliff in a wind that peeled the words out of your mouth. You are owed is not a thing you say to collect. It is a thing you say to pass on. The whole weight of the red coat comes down in the end to one quiet arithmetic. That a man carried out of the dark owes a carry to someone else, and the man who does the carrying asks for nothing, and the ledger stays clear only as long as somebody is still willing to go into the storm. I stand my post. I do not flinch. And on the worst morning when it truly matters, I move faster than any man in a good coat will ever expect, not because the cage made me, but because a cliff did 20 years ago in the dark. That is where a man learns to have nothing. He learns it so that, on the one day it counts, he has everything exactly where it needs to be.